National Global Youth Discussion. We are honored to have you here, and we'd like to, yes, also just welcome to our distinguished guest speakers who will be introduced in a short while. Before we officially start with the session, I would just like to ask that you familiarize yourself with the house rules for this discussion, which is displayed on the screen in front of you, and contact the email address should you encounter any technical difficulties. And just to note that the opinions of the guest speakers discussed here today is not an opinion of Stellenbosch University International and is not represented in our formal capacity as a division. And without further ado, I would like to introduce our guest facilitator, Louw from SU International, who will be leading this session. Just a bit of background of Bantu. He is a deeply passionate about education, enabling empowerment and community engagement. And having worked as an educator, secondary school and tertiary levels, he has always used his agency and passion for the empowerment of people in service of others. He has been working in international higher education for approximately 6.5 years, from community engagement, service learning to mobility. He's passionate about topics specifically related to higher education, decolonization and transformation, Pan-Africanism, wellness, leadership development, and student success. And his passions and vocational experience as a clinician, apologies, have seen him invest his time, knowledge, and scholarly engagement in collaborations with multiple entities across universities. With a range of professional affiliations to his name, both nationally and internationally, and the benefit of his youth, he attempts to bring a fresh and nuanced voice to the conversations of higher education internationalization. So without further ado, Bantu, I would like to thank you for availing yourself, and I would like to hand over to you. Let me share your presentation, and you're welcome to go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that lengthy introduction there, Simon. Good afternoon, everybody. Very welcome to this conversation. Just a disclaimer, I'm joining you from my car because we have electricity outage because of scheduled maintenance. So I'm sitting in the car and joining you from here. I trust you'll be able to hear me, and by all means, please feel free to engage in the conversation as much as possible. We would love to have you engage in the chat box. Please feel free as we proceed through the conversation to pop up your questions there, and we will deal with them as we go along. Along with me, I have two colleagues of mine, Mr. Ryan Johnson as well as Ms. Alison Mlitwa. They will introduce themselves very briefly when they start their presentations. We only have 1 hour and we've got quite a lot to discuss, so we will try to run through it as succinctly as possible, yet without compromising any of the comprehensive thoughts that we'd like to share with you. So let's get this show on the road. The presentation has about 4 different things I want to touch on, and then I'll hand over to Alison, who will then subsequently hand over to Ryan to continue, and then we will then have a question and answer session. So we know this question that higher education institutions are under immense pressure in local as well as global contexts. COVID-19 as a pandemic is not necessarily helping us very much as well. So we have an urgent need to contend with socio-political and socio-economic, as well as societal and disruptive technological challenges within the higher education spectrum. We're increasingly starting to see that the traditional university model as we know it is no longer sustainable, and it is under immense critique and questioning, obviously calling us to even invest in disruptive innovation insofar as looking at higher education and its response to societal problems. Now, in the next slide, you will see I've just briefly given you a synopsis of what the general role of higher education is insofar as it caters to various stakeholders and their different goals. So generally for students, universities prepare them for employment. It's an avenue to explore their academic interests. It's a path to adulthood and self-discovery as well as independence. For the public sector, education as a public good. It's a source for the well-trained labor force, a source for research and innovation, research for societal impact, training of responsible citizenry, as well as fostering commitment for the common good, as well as social cohesion. Universities also have a role to play in the private sector to make sure not only that we train people ready to enter the job market, but also that we are relevant in our research outputs insofar as we respond to the needs of the private sector. So what are some of the challenges that the higher education sector then faces? In my introductory remarks, I said that the higher education is under some immense challenges. And I've outlined 5 of these, the sources from the Economist Intellectual Intelligence Unit, rather. And these 5 are very specifically the challenges. 1 is to contribute to an increasingly digital economy and society. 2, to leverage technologies to deliver better and more inclusive education. To respond to the growing demand, but also shifting demographics, to strike a balance between public and private provision, and lastly, to remain global in an age of nationalism. And we will touch on these challenges a little bit more as we go on in the presentation. Of course, I said one of the roles for higher education is, of course, to contribute to the labor market, to obviously lead to employment and better equip students with employment. As a key contributor to preparing people for the job market, one can also see that we are faced with global high rates of unemployment, very specifically amongst the youth. In South Africa, as you can see in the picture, it's not peculiar to see graduates with great qualifications stand at robots and traffic lights and beg for jobs. And so there's this paradox then that many countries cannot necessarily find the right people to fill the jobs, although the unemployment rate in these countries are incredibly high. So that then leaves us with a question around to what extent are universities equipping students to be able to adequately respond to the job market? To what extent are the skills that we equip students with responsive and sufficient to be able to fill those empty jobs? And of course, we can go on in the conversation around graduate preparation as well as postgraduate preparation and its role in preparing people for employment and ultimately the job market. So I am navigating from my phone. If I do skip 2 slides too fast, I'll just move back a little bit forward. Please bear with me. So part of what universities do then in terms of being innovative and transformative and game changers is to also then engage in what we call internationalization of higher education, not only as a disruptive, innovative activity, but at the same time as a transformative activity. And so to ensure that education is more attractive and appropriate, but also globally comparative and responsive, higher education institutions then adopt various internationalization approaches and strategies to supplement the core curriculum within the university. And many of these internationalization activities include research collaborations, partnerships, as well as student and staff mobility. And there are various benefits relating to higher education internationalization. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go through all of them because I'd much rather, we get as much from the conversation in the discussion as opposed to me going through all of this in detail. Some of the things you can see there is an enhanced international cooperation and capacity building. It's also about enhancing the curriculum. It's about adding to the university's prestige and the university's global profile, making sure that graduates, have the best qualifications and therefore lead to improved graduate employability, improved quality of teaching and learning, increased awareness and deeper engagement around global issues. And this is part of the conversation that we will also have about the role of internationalization in response to global issues. and a number of various other benefits to the institution. What we also then see is that there are a range of benefits to the students. I apologize if this is a little bit illegible or too small on your side. Um, but if you can just zoom it in from your side and read some of it. So there's a range of benefits from cross-cultural goals to academic goals, as well as to professional and lifelong goals, language attainment, intercultural competency attainment, etc. And from these benefits, one can see that there is definitely worth an investment to make in higher education internationalization, insofar as it contributes to students' advancement, as well as the profile of the university, and lastly, the ability to make sure that we produce world-class graduates that will be able to respond to the labor market. There are, however, quite a number of challenges, and this presentation is not all doom and gloom. At the end of the presentation, we will touch base on some proposals and examples on the way forward to how we can leverage internationalization better to be responsive both to the local as well as to the global societal challenges. One of the first things that we see as a challenge, invariably, that we hear from a lot of people is that international mobility, international student profiles generally represent the most privileged of different societies. And so what we then see is the people that are able to go to these world-class institutions that can travel abroad are often people that come from privileged backgrounds. And unsurprisingly, then, of course, that raises another question around to what extent does higher education internationalization and mobility contribute to a class and a race inequality? Because when we talk about privilege and class in South Africa, we know that that is divided across racial lines. And therefore, one can ask the question, to what extent does higher education internationalization contribute to or is harmful to a certain extent to equality and the establishment of class relations. And questions that one can ask is, who gets to study abroad and who does not get to? For whom is it a privilege, and for whom is it just a necessary add-on that you can add, as simple as going to the shop and buying a chocolate? When we have in South Africa students discussing fees must fall and debates around the high fees of education and access to higher education, and versus study abroad. If students can't even afford to study at university in the first place, how can they afford to go and study abroad? Um, and then, of course, one can have a conversation around the rankings, the attribution of prestige title to universities, who gets to be called, a world-class or a leading institution, and who gets to be excluded on what basis. And of course, Alison is going to touch a little bit more on some of these questions relating to curriculum standardization, etc., rankings, and all of these things insofar as they contribute to the rankings. For some institutions favorably, but for some institutions to a disadvantage. And then asking again the broader question, doesn't it continuously create a divide and an inequality even amongst institutions? And then, of course, one can go on to the availability of funding from governments, higher education institutions, and various organizations. Some of the institutions in South Africa, for example, that were previously white institutions, are very well laced with money in their pockets, and therefore can afford to contribute more to higher education internationalization than previously black disadvantaged universities could do so. And so, for example, also, an African country might not necessarily have enough capital to be able to invest in bursaries for higher education internationalization and mobility, as would be the case for an institution in Europe. And all of these questions, of course, have deep historical things that one can unpack in the conversation around the transformation that needs to happen within the higher education space in general. So we can't deny, obviously, also that there's a big role that governments play also to a large extent in higher education internationalization. And so the political and international agendas of higher education institutions are often impacted And universities are oftentimes used as tools to promote certain countrywide and national interests insofar as it relates to politics and international relations. Jane Knight, a leading scholar in internationalization, introduces us to the concept of knowledge diplomacy. And what it basically means is that the role of the higher education institution, education, research, and innovation is in building and strengthening relations between and amongst countries. It also presents us with a new approach to exploring the relationship between these institutions and international relations. In one of my previous slides, I spoke about the role that the university plays to various stakeholders. And so contribution to research outputs and collaborations and all of these things to respond to societal needs is part of the university's mandate. But we know that that mandate, of course, can then be influenced by money, by donors, whether it's individual donors and or whether it's institutions, organizations, or governments. Invariably, institutions then take their mandate, or their mandate to a certain extent will be influenced by the donors. And so whilst Jane introduces us to knowledge diplomacy, it's very important to note that knowledge diplomacy can very well also be used inversely as a soft power, where where governments and other institutions use the university as a conduit to basically advance various national and political interests. What we can see is, I'm making an example with transnational education as a soft power. And of course, you're welcome to challenge me on this. It's an idea I'm introducing. Presently, about 36 British universities offer around 625 degree courses on different levels, from undergrad all the way to postgraduate level in Hong Kong. Now, of course, there's also an expectation that these universities are presenting their curriculum in English to Hong Kong nationals. In 2008, the transnational education was worth about £237 million to the UK economy. And in 2025, that is estimated to grow to about £870 million. So we're talking big money here, massive money. And then the question then around this issue is, if people are investing that much money, what are the interests that come with that investment? And some examples we can use, for example, also is China and its establishment of various Chinese Confucius institutes across universities, or the introduction of Chinese. I'm not sure, is somebody raising a hand? Okay. Or, for example, the introduction of Chinese as a language in the public schooling system. Or even what we now begin to see is various higher education institutions establishing campuses across different countries. So some of the questions that I've put there to ponder on is, to what extent is the curricula of that university responsive and relevant to the knowledge economy as well as the job market and its demands? To what extent does it contribute to the brain drain and the unemployment? Because if it's not responsive, then you'll have unemployed graduates. And what those graduates will then do is invariably they leave their home countries to go seek employment elsewhere, and therefore they contribute to the economy of another country. So it contributes to a brain drain for these countries. And to what extent does it, what am I saying there? To what extent does it promote certain foreign policy agendas, certain soft power and political agendas? And these are all some of the critiques around higher education internationalization, insofar as it relates to our ability then to be able to be critical and responsive to our societal needs, but at the same time to be able to respond adequately to the demands of the job market and create graduates that are not only globally competitive and comparable, but at the same time that are able to be brilliant and competitive and leaders of thought and production in their own countries. Then, of course, another issue that one can touch on in some of the critique relating to internationalization is around great tension around mobility as a result of increasing populism, nationalist tendencies, as well as a strong public anti-immigration discourse. And we've seen this across the world. And this has a direct impact ultimately also on some students' ability and interest to go and even pursue a study abroad opportunity in a different country. An example of that might be, for example, a black man, black young male student being hesitant to go study in the United States of America, particularly because of reports around police brutality and the senseless killing of black people, as we've seen also with the recent spark of the Black Lives Matter protests. Or, for example, somebody not wanting to go to Indonesia that is part of the LGBTQAI plus community because of the risk of being criminalized for your sexual orientation or your gender identity. Or someone, for example, from Europe, not wanting to come to South Africa because of gender-based violence and femicide in the country. And so all of these factors invariably have an impact ultimately on somebody's decision on where they want to go study abroad and if they can go study abroad. But of course, these are just some of the challenges that we face when a student has to decide ultimately around whether or not they want to study abroad. It's not necessarily all doom and gloom. It has its pros and cons. There's a definite need, like I said initially, for a disruptive innovation within higher education institutions. In 2010, when we had the global economic crisis, universities were blessed with an amazing opportunity to disrupt and to change, but they haven't done so. And we've subsequently seen roads must fall, fees must fall, decolonization protests around universities, because to a large extent, universities still, in many countries, are the enclave of, to a large extent, your academics are white, they are male, and they are very old. And so then we also have racial disparities in universities, which contributes to ultimately the knowledge production and its relevance. Hence, we talk about the need for decolonization so that education and knowledge production is responsive to the society and is a reflection of the society. Or we can talk about pay disparity between males and females within the academe, where male lecturers invariably for the same portfolio would earn a little bit more than a female lecturer, irrespective of whether they produce less or more in research output. And these are some of the challenges then that one needs to think about. COVID-19 provides us again with a great platform and an opportunity to innovate and to think creatively. We are now moving to an online world and we all have to contend with it, although we are too late already as South Africa in this online thing. So now we see many universities jump on the bandwagon of massive open online courses. We see many of them thinking about virtual mobilities and all of these things, which is good and well, right? But the question here and the caution is plugging necessarily, taking your curriculum as it is and putting it online is not necessarily the correct response to the challenges that we face as a globe currently. We need to go a little bit more than just putting our curriculum online. We need to disrupt that curriculum tremendously so that on the one end it is responsive and that it is also a curriculum that is revolutionary to a certain extent. So when we then look at South Africa, for example, if we're going to jump on the bandwagon of going online, then we sit with questions around some student, Katazamanya Madoda, Zungu, that sits in Matatiele with no network connection and rife unemployment and poverty in his family. So a computer is on the last list of priorities because it's a privilege. It's a nice to have. And to what extent then are we disadvantaging Katazamanya Madoda to that extent that we are able to go online, but not necessarily take into account the reality of a large majority of South African students? The Economist Intelligence Unit the recent report that they released proposes a very different future for us in how we can innovatively change higher education and disrupt it. And they provide us with 5 models. The open university model, which is a model that leverages internet technology to offer degrees virtually. Basically, what we see now universities do to a large extent with moving online, and therefore allowing universities to take in more and more students and opening the university space up to more people. But of course, we have spoken about the extent to which that would exclude, for example, a large majority of African students from the African continent and other countries that are poor. Then we have the cluster model that brings together different institutions and leverages their strengths and create efficiencies. But we must also then be wary of that fact that, you know, when you have these private institutions that come together as a conglomerate, to what extent then, of course, they will also have power and resources to influence generally the agenda on a large scale model. We have the experiential model that blends together traditional learning with hands-on work experience, preparing students for professional life. And we see this in many TVET colleges in South Africa, for example, where students get, you know, a practical and technical expertise to be able to respond to the job market. That's a model worth looking into. It's a model certainly that I think will help us in responding. But the shortcoming there, of course, is that there is not sufficient collaboration between private and public sector, as well as these TVET colleges and these technical colleges, insofar as it will be able to produce a curriculum that's responsive to the needs. So it's not peculiar to find Koffiefontein, Technikon have a curriculum of 2008 in 2020 that a student is poor, but just because they've been told education is the key and this is a cheap college they go to, so they get a certificate only to come sit at home with it or stand on the traffic lights and beg for a job. And so there needs to be a collaboration between private, public, and the higher education sectors. Then we have the partnership model that involves building relationship with external partners for collaborating, funding, and employment opportunities. And lastly, there we have the liberal arts model, which I will touch base on in some examples of what we already have in South Africa. And so what you can see is, for example, Stellenbosch University having its BCom International Business degree that has a compulsory mobility window in it, or a BEng with data engineering, or BCom Mathematical Sciences with a data science specific focus. They've recently established the School for Data Science and Computational Thinking. So we can see that already universities are starting to think creatively around their curriculum, insofar as we need to equip students with both necessary STEM-related knowledge, but also humanities, which is why, of course, many people in the STEM fields are unable to respond to some of the humanities-based societal problems because there is a lack in the depth of these qualifications. Wits University is an example, as you can see, some of the collaborations that they have, as well as the University of Johannesburg. On the left side there, you will see we're already also busy with disruptive technology. Although we're a little bit late, but we are making progress. I've got 2 examples from the University of Pretoria with their robot library assistant there, and also one of their professors there that led a team that performed the world's first middle ear transplant as a response to deafness using 3D printed bones. And so there are already these disruptive ways to move ahead, but they are not enough, and we need to invest in more of them. And my last shot then before I hand over is my proposal that we need to creatively think around changing our degree structures. So instead of having your traditional 4-year degree structure that basically takes you from A to Z, the job market actually starts telling us that these degrees are redundant. And what we then now need to do is break away from this and have a university system that is flexible, where students can hop on, hop off invariably through the life cycle, where somebody goes into an institution, go and get a few skills, go into the job market, and come back and brush up those skills again, and basically make education a continuous and lifelong experience. Certainly, insofar as that will respond to the labor market, it will also deeply help us in leveraging our resources to reduce poverty and unemployment, because people can go for 1 year, they can come out with a skill that is needed in the job market, and they can come back if there's a gap in the job market and get another skill. But obviously, these will require deep disruptive thinking and collaborative thought and money from, amongst others, governments, other organizations, as well as a deeper collaboration between institutions around the standardization of curriculum, etc. And on that note, I'd like to give over to my colleague Alison, who will expand a little bit more on that. Thank you very much.
Alison, excuse me, before you go ahead, can I just ask that all participants please switch off their video and mute their microphones? Thank you, Alison. Over to you.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining. I don't know. Yeah, I think I'm supposed to introduce myself, right? I work in quality assurance at Stellenbosch University, and I'm also pursuing postgraduate studies in the field of higher education with Rhodes University. So that's just briefly me. Okay, can everybody share my screen? Everything's good. All right. So the questions that I have been asked to address in my 10 minutes suggest that there's a certain tension in the area of international study or study abroad or student mobility. I was asked to talk around questions around what informs our decisions on what partnerships to pursue, and the level of accessibility to European, American, and Asian mobility opportunities as opposed to mobility opportunities in Africa. I suppose it's strange also for us at Stellenbosch University, where most of our international students come from other African countries as opposed to Europe and America. And that for me reads as an indication that perhaps our African family is more interested in us, while our relationship with them is perhaps less reciprocal. And there might be numerous reasons for why that might be the case. And it also appears that we are more allured by opportunities to European and American universities, and there might also be specific reasons for that as well. In my 10 minutes, I wanted to perhaps have us look critically at what are the tensions in the internationalization of higher education. And maybe just to start off with understanding higher education as not being neutral and that it is highly political. Nussbaum also articulated that the focus on internationalization of information rather than the formation of students' critical and imaginative capacities. And then also what Davies and Bansal said about how freedom is re-articulated as freedom from want to gain through individual entrepreneurial activity. And also again commenting on the neoliberal rhetoric that we also find in the internationalization of higher education, like the familiar terms like information economy, knowledge economy, and how we must now produce the kind of students that can be role players in the information economy and can take up roles in the knowledge economy. And then also Mbembe talking about the pluriversity. The university must be replaced by a pluriversity. Pluriversity meaning knowledge production that is open to epistemic diversity and not the Eurocentric module that is being pursued to be universal and reproduced everywhere. And also talking about how the relationship between the global north and the global south continues to be characterized by considerable power imbalances. So that brings us to this tension between, okay, higher education for the public good and higher education as a private good. In our South African context, teaching and learning there's an explicit demand on teaching and learning to contribute to social justice. And when we talk about social justice, we mean inclusion, redistribution, and representation. And then there's also commentary, also when we think about the role of higher education in the development, in our own country's development, and how higher education is now the servant of economic growth. And also when we reflect on the effect of the World Trade Organization's general agreement on trade of services and what kind of impact that has on higher education. And when we think around issues around the commodification of higher education. And also to think broadly, like what did the Lisbon strategy aim for the European Union, and also to think about the Bologna process. In an article that Moskovitz and Zahavi wrote, they are arguing that the Bologna process is being used as a foreign policy tool, and also to be critical about that. And in that same article, they spoke about what Figueroa and Robertson said about the Bologna and how they critiqued it as a European hegemonic instrument, and that it is expansionist in nature. Okay, so looking at the kinds of tensions that relate to the internationalization of higher education, I'm thinking specifically about a chapter that formed part of a publication in it was a book edited by Leibovich, and the chapter's name was Cultivating Globalization in Engineering Courses, and it was authored by Boney, McDonald, and Paris, and they used Martha Nussbaum's 3 fundamentals abilities that she argues cultivates is important for cultivating humanity, and they used that to build a curriculum that was pedagogically based on the development on education. And when they talk about development education, they are sorry, I'm starting to get worried about the time. Anyway, so going back to the 3 fundamental capabilities is the one of critical thinking and cosmopolitan ability and having an imaginative understanding. So critical thinking has to do with having the capacity to critically examine oneself and one's own traditions. Cosmopolitan ability has to do with multicultural education and acquainting students with some fundamentals about the histories and cultures of the many different groups with whom they share laws and institutions. And also, I think for us here in South Africa to also forgo this need for South African exceptionalism and valuing and respecting diversity. And then again, in the imaginative understanding is having the ability to be able to place yourself in somebody else's shoes, and to be an intelligent reader of another person's story. So if we go back to think about critically using these abilities and thinking about the motivations behind student mobility, what if our decisions around student ability was motivated by the pursuit in the cultivation of humanity, and what would happen if we made the cultivation of humanity the dominating discourse in student mobility? I'm just thinking also about the student protest of 2015, 2016, which demonstrated that students feel that it does matter who's teaching and what they are teaching and who they're teaching it to. And they are also critiquing the neoliberalist rhetoric that is dominant when we speak about development. And then also thinking about what Louw wrote about Bologna and how it impacts Africa. I think perhaps as students we also need to think about what role we can play in setting the agenda for student mobility. I think many times, especially as Africans, we neglect and thinking about what is it that we need from the world. We are so busy trying to fit into the world and listening to outside voices saying what Africa needs and what we must aspire to and be and play to the needs of the global north. But I want to challenge us to think about first thinking about what it is that we need and to position our needs, and then like thinking about, okay, so what do we need and how do we and relating to the world from that perspective. Yeah, that's me.
Thank you very much, Alison, for that very insightful presentation. Ryan, we're handing over to you.
All right. Hello, everybody. My name is Ryan Johnson, and I'm joining you from Tenerife in the Canary Islands. I'm not going to share a some slides with you, or perhaps I will in a bit. I'm not too keen on slides. I just maybe want to sort of have a conversation about this whole concept of internationalization. And I've been invited to this conversation to speak to the relationship between socioeconomic dynamics and higher education internationalization in the global South, which is quite a broad geographical area, but I'm going to focus my attention mainly on South Africa and Southern Africa. So I've worked in higher education for some time. I worked at Stellenbosch in its transformation office, and I've worked on a project on student mobility with the transformation office and the international office. I've also worked at the Institute for New Economic Thinking, and there I was responsible for a research working group of African academics and young scholars who were working together and also collaborating with colleagues across the world. So I was there in the main responsible in seeing that this working group had access to the resources they needed to deliver the best internationally recognized research. So I come to this conversation from that perspective. And I'm going to talk a little bit. I just want to make sure I don't go over time, so I'm going to set my timer. So I want to talk a little bit about the relationship between socioeconomics and higher education internationalization in South Africa and in the Global South. Okay, so why is it important for us to take a look at the socioeconomic implications of higher education internationalization? Now, I'm going to predominantly critique the concept of higher education internationalization in South Africa. So, but I want to start, before I deliver this critique, I want to maybe quote, just to sort of ease your mind in not thinking that I'm anti-internationalization. I'm very pro-internationalization, but I think critique is important for us to deliver the benefits of internationalization of higher education to everybody. So I'm going to quote the Freedom Charter of 1955. So the Freedom Charter is perhaps the precursor, I guess, or the foundation of today's South African Constitution. And in the Freedom Charter, the Freedom Charter makes reference to internationalization, or at least I interpret this quote as making reference to the importance of internationalization for the freedom of all South Africans, right? So I'm quoting, all of the cultural treasures of mankind shall be open to all by free exchange of books, ideas, and contact with other lands. So the Freedom Charter here really thinks that it's important for South Africans and for their freedom to have access to and connect with knowledge and ideas from across the world, right? And preferably also to input into the knowledge, into the global knowledge economy. So, okay, so now, how do I position internationalization and socioeconomics, right? Firstly, I would like to start by sharing what I understand by internationalization of higher education. In this context, the context of this conversation, higher education to me is some sort of institutional organization which provides some form of education that succeeds primary education. So you have it's a tertiary form of education, right? And then the internationalization of higher education, or what we call universities, right? And the internationalization of higher education then follows as, and I'm quoting Knight and Kumari here, two academics who work on internationalization, and they sort of understand internationalization as a process of integrating an intercultural and international dimension into all areas of the university, right? So from cultural experiences to research to innovation, etc., right? To standardization. Okay, so by this understanding of internationalization, I want to extrapolate my sort of thoughts and ideas. How do institutions do this internationalization process? All right, they do this in the main through two things, which I picked up in the literature on higher education internationalization. They do this through, one, student mobility, which all of us are familiar with. I mean, Bantu, for example, and the guys organizing this webinar works in student mobility in the main, but they also do it through what we call transnational education, or TNEs. These are satellite campuses. For example, I've been hearing since 2017 that Harvard wants to open up, a campus, a Harvard Business School in Cape Town. So this is also, or like Bantu mentioned earlier about UK universities going to the Far East and establishing, an Oxford or a Cambridge satellite campus there. So this is also part of an internationalization strategy, right? So considering this then, how do I link it to socioeconomics? And let me start by perhaps explaining what I understand by the term socioeconomics. So in its simplest sense, socioeconomics is the relationship between the social and economic dynamics in a society. So I would reduce it to perhaps saying the material and immaterial conditions of a society, which determines an individual's well-being, right? For those of us who work in economics and studied it for a bit, would sort of think of it as the material being, food, clothes, buying a car or a house and that sort of thing, having access to money, and the immaterial well-being being mainly around, crime, poverty, your existence within the society, mental health, which is also coming into the economic literature more and more, as the immaterial. So here you have socioeconomics comprises of both that immaterial condition and the material. But of course, in a capitalist society, epoch we find ourselves in, which can mainly be described as capitalist, the social is by and large determined by the economics, right? So in that relationship, socioeconomic, I think economic has, a much has much greater power over the social, the immaterial existence of or well-being of the individual. So this is a truism in economics. I mean, if you read the literature, for example, on inequality, like Thomas Piketty, for example, or Joseph Stiglitz, who deal with political economy issues, they would highlight to us more or less why this is a truism, why economics is in the main determining our social existence, right? Of course, if you are on the left of the political spectrum, you could also always read Karl Marx. So this is what we understand by socioeconomics, or what I understand by socioeconomics, and what I want to bring into the conversation here. Oh gosh, I only have 2 minutes into the conversation here. All right, so okay, so I want to quote something by Kumrani, who has been quite a source of inspiration for me during this discussion. So they bring this dynamic of socioeconomic and higher education internationalization much closer than, for example, I would in my language. Knight, so Kumrani quotes Knight and Alchbach, and they describe the influence of globalization, which is an economic concept, on internationalization, which we are talking here, as the economic, political, and social forces pushing 21st century higher education towards greater international involvement. All right, so here we have globalization, which we use as a proxy, perhaps in this conversation, for the economic dimension, pushing internationalization into greater economic, political, and societal, as a greater economic, political, and societal force, pushing 21st century higher education towards greater internationalization. So globalization is basically steering what we understand internationalization to be. All right, so I hope that kind of strengthens the sort of connection between internationalization and economics, right, and socioeconomics. So the move of the university from a, so what does this mean? What does this mean for higher education internationalization? So what does this mean first for higher education, this internationalization? So for higher education, it means that now higher education is being shaped by economic incentives, right? Is being shaped in terms of what they offer, how they operate, is now being shaped by these economic forces. But this has an implication for the society, for the social, right? Because we understand higher education or universities to not only be an institution where you learn, but also to be an institution or an organization that creates output into the society, in order to make the society a better place, in order to, increase or further our well-being and our societal development, right? So, but of course, if economics are shaping internationalization, higher education, and doing this through international, I think now we need to stop and ask, okay, but so what does this mean? Oh, that's my timer. A little bit more time, Bantu.
Ryan, I'll give you one more minute to wrap it up. So
all right.
We give our guests some time to engage.
All right. Okay, let me wrap it up. Anyway, so then the big question is here. Okay, so what do we say now, right? So it means to us, what does this mean? What does the economics mean? What does internationalization mean for higher education if we look at it through the economics and the socio-economics? So it raises a couple of questions, and I'm going to just mention that, and maybe hopefully someone in the discussion can help us think a bit more about it. But we ask questions. So now I'm going to look at economic problems or consequences. So we look at income inequality and access to higher education, right? So and then we look at mobility. So South African and you're poor, sort of having access to higher education and being mobile within the higher education space, it might be problematic for you or perhaps difficult for you. We need to ask questions of what are the incentives? What are the economic incentives for internationalization of higher education? Why is it so important for globalization to push higher education? What does it mean for profits? What does it mean for people? What does it mean for global economic development? And who benefits from that, right? And then, of course, I want to conclude by saying, I think it's important for us to do internationalization of higher education. But in order for us to do it right, in order for us to reap the benefits thereof, we need to look at what are the critiques of higher education internationalization. We need to look at what are the economic factors that pushes higher education internationalization, and how do these economic factors either benefit or harm our society. But we cannot only look at internationalization as from a non-critical perspective, and perhaps that's what I would invite Bantu and his colleagues to do at the international office at Stellenbosch. All right, that's me.
Thank you very much, Ryan. Thank you very much, colleagues, for the very insightful contributions. I am sorry that we couldn't keep it under the hour. At this point in time, I'd like to invite some questions from the floor. If you can maybe just unmute yourself and go for it, and we take it from there.
Greetings, everyone. Am I audible enough?
I can hear you, yes.
Oh, okay. No, thank you. Speaking is Keamogetse Masike. I'd like to greet everyone on this platform and thank everyone for this opportunity. I'd like to add on the submissions that Leadership Louw made on the restructuring of institutions of higher learning in them being lifelong institutions, meaning that our universities, COVID-19 has proven that our universities have failed the social and economic spaces of this country, of our people, meaning that they've proven not to have solutions to many of the problems that the society are facing, to be particular, unemployment, poverty, and all of those things that we're facing in communities. So I'd like to submit and agree with leadership Louw on the fact that university should be transformed to being skills development centers rather than them being libraries of theory which doesn't have practical solutions to problems that we're facing in our communities. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that insightful contribution, Kiamukhetsi. I'm inclined to agree with you. And one of the critiques also is that universities are oftentimes seen to be responsive instead of being proactive. So universities always want to respond instead of being creative and progressive and actually innovate and be forward thinking. So very powerful points there. Thank you for that. Anybody else? Sorry, I was muted there. But is there somebody there?
Bantu, I see we have a.
Good afternoon, colleagues. Thank you so much for engaging on such a discussion. This is Millet from Respublica, and yeah, thank you so much, everybody, for the insightful information. One of the things that I was thinking while you guys are presenting is we also need to look at how this online learning has brought into comparison to the way that your short learning institutions are booming and actually be having more relevant qualifications as compared to our university systems. So, Mr. Bantu, when you talk about lifelong learning institutions, the question that I have in mind is, as an example, we don't have, not that I know of, but you know, I don't feel that our universities are catching up with things that are really going to help in the future of where we are going for technology, like where we moving into the era of robotics and, you know, digitization. And most of the time when you hear of all of these kinds of courses or skills that are available, you find them from short learning courses or institutions that are not universities or big centered structures. So I think this is concerning for me to say that, you know, somebody might ask, are we still actually getting relevant qualifications from the university? And is it something that they should perhaps also be going back to the drawing table to say, but, you know, with the future of where we are going, are we preparing the output, or are we having a great output in terms of the student generation or the generation that we have, and with the current circumstances in the country? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Millet, for that insightful contribution. And as you were speaking, I was reminded, but I just want to put the disclaimer again. The views shared here are not that of Stellenbosch University and are not representative of the university. The university still pays my salary, so I just have to put the disclaimer out there. But one of the questions that I often ask in my engagements, and Alison mentioned it too, is this obsession with being exclusive, right? We want to be world class. We want to be the leading university, blah, 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 blah. Why can't we just be one of, right? And Ryan touched also on the extent to which capitalism and global capital then influences that exclusivity, even insofar as it relates to internationalization. Stellenbosch University recently started and opened a world-class school for computational thinking and something data science and computational thinking. Great, right? And they are bragging about it across the world. Fantastic, right? It's innovative work. My question just is, to what extent is that an accolade to celebrate if, for example, if we want to be the leading university in Africa, we cannot open up that space for students from Fort Hare on a, say, a winter break, September holidays or March holidays or June holidays, to come and be exposed and tap into those resources. If we can't bring students from Venda who don't even have computers into Stellenbosch for a short week winter program to be exposed to these things, to what extent are we then wanting to be a leading institution in Africa, but we leave everybody else behind? Are we then not necessarily just aspiring to chase after Europe? And on that note, I want to introduce the other question around internationalization for locals. To what extent can we standardize curriculum so that we bring a student from Walter Sisulu University to do an exchange at University of Cape Town, and we take a student from the University of Cape Town to go to Nelson Mandela University, and in so doing, expose one another to the very different and realistic challenges that these institutions face, but at the same time, exposing ourselves to the resources and growing together jointly, as opposed to wanting to be these exclusive and world-leading institutions. I don't know if my colleagues from the panelists want to take a bite on that one.
Yeah, now I'm just gonna go back to what Nussbaum says about the university role as being the place where we cultivate humanity, and I think that is the thing that you are touching on when you are talking about this type of collaboration amongst local universities here.
Yeah. If I could just chip in there, I think, yes, I guess the big question comes again back to, you know, why we do internationalization. And if I'm right, and the people I've been reading, the literature I've been reading is right, the incentives aren't really there for institutions, local institutions in South Africa to do that, based on the political economy of internationalization. You know, like it doesn't pay for a university to get a student from Nelson Mandela or Walter Sisulu and then swapping them, because, you know, their resources all come from the same pot. But if you get a student from the US or from Asia or from Europe, it makes financial sense, doesn't it, to sort of have these type of exchanges. So I think economics plays a major role. I think it's poorly understood in the internationalization literature, higher education internationalization literature now. But I think there are some critiques that are helping us better understand it, and it's something that we need to think about. How does this prevent us from, even within South Africa, our local institutions getting exposed to one another, our students there getting exposed to one another, learning from one another, and creating a knowledge economy that's quite interconnected in South Africa?
Thank you very much, Ryan. You're raising a very important point there. We are running out of time. Babalwa earlier spoke also, just as a latch on to what Alison speaks about, the university being to respond to humanism. The question insofar as the university and internationalization can be used to leverage greater collaboration to solve world problems, to solve societal problems. And I'm not entirely sure that we are getting that right to a certain extent, because what we see in many institutions is critical thought and radical engagement being policed and stifled insofar as it does not adhere to the archaical norms and standards of what engagement is about at university. But we see with disruptive protests like fees must fall, roads must fall, Open Stellenbosch, Leicester, and gender-based violence, etc., is young people robustly and radically saying to the institution, we are no longer going to have these conversations that have no meaningful impact and contribution to society. It's either we disrupt, we can think about this critically and hard, or we are going to bring you to the table by fire, by force. And I think that internationalization provides us with that opportunity to bring communities closer, to have these conversations about issues that affect society. Simon, at this point in time, I'd like to give over to you. I'm not sure if there's anybody that would like to take a last bite, but I'm wary about your time also.
Sorry, can I maybe, as very concise as possible, make a submission? I'm from,
yes,
my name is Mondro. I'm from the University of the Free State. And something that I, just to add on in the question of internationalization, what is the impact of how politically inclined students are, especially if we look at SRC elections and there being a political aspect to that, and that the agenda or propaganda from political parties and that impact at the university and the spaces therein, what is that impact to internationalization, and also if we speak about decolonization of the curriculum?
Powerful question, Mondro. I think, you know, the problem with it is, and I mean, let's take Stellenbosch University, for example, whose elections are not organized on the basis of political party affiliation. But that does not mean that those elections are not highly politicized. And I want to introduce us or just make mention of the idea of a university in society, a university in community. And so very importantly, politics and the political landscape definitely has a massive impact on the debates at university campuses, as it should be, because politics informs our society, and the university in essence is a vehicle for knowledge production for society. So the question here is not necessarily that politics should be excluded from engagement at university. That is why we have political science and international relations as theoretical subjects, because of the importance of these to the political landscape and the societal debates. The question here should really be around, to what extent can we separate narrow political agendas and mandates insofar as we are responsible for producing knowledge for societal change? And so if our political engagement further marginalizes, or our political engagement further ostracizes us from the critical issues that are relevant in society, then that doesn't help us to any extent, for that matter. So I encourage the close collaboration between the political field as well as the education field, in as much as I encourage civil society, religion, and all of these other key players to have closer collaboration with the university, as much as we invite capital to have closer collaboration with the university, because that is where young minds are shaped. That is where the leaders for tomorrow are cultivated. And if we do not have all of these other factors that are equally important to societal functioning involved in the shaping of ideas at a university level, then we're basically sitting with a situation like we do in South Africa, where you have age-old people that should be in old age homes leading our country, absolutely no clue to what's really happening on the ground or what are the issues facing the youth. And so you have old people that are basically passing policies and making decisions that are not responsive at all or relevant to the issues that face society. But if we have them involved in conversation with young people at university, then I think we have a greater opportunity to effect meaningful change in all of those other landscapes as well. Thank you very much.
Ryan, I see your hand is up. Before I conclude, if you want to perhaps just raise your point. 1 minute.
All right. 1 minute. Okay, so I think it's a very, very important question on politicization, like politics on campuses, and what that means for higher education, internationalization. If you think about the contribution that the decolonization discourse, for example, here in South Africa, made to sort of the global discourse on higher education. You know, how decolonization was internationalized through political discourses on South African university campuses. I mean, it just proves a point to us that, you know, politics are important for us to be able to partake in and also contribute to the global knowledge economy, like for the example of decolonization in South Africa. Yeah, done. Thanks.
Thank you, Ryan. So thank you to everyone. This brings us to the end of this session, unfortunately, and definitely the idea is planted to definitely facilitate more of these discussions. So I would like to thank all our guest speakers, firstly for your energy and also for facilitating a meaningful and very crucial discussion. Thank you, Bantu, for also arranging this. And also thank you to all the attendees for joining and taking the time in concluding this discussion series that has taken place for the past month. I wish you all a lovely afternoon, and yes, I will hereby end the session.
Thank you, Simone. Yes, thank you. Some of the responses we've put in the comments there for some of the people that asked questions in the comment box. You got that, Simone?
We've got that. Thank you, Bantu. Thank you to everyone.
Thank you, everybody, for joining. Have a lovely day.
Bye-bye.